military service has its heroes, and if you level up enough, you become legend. If you served in the United States Navy, you might have heard of this guy. If you were a Navy diver or a submariner, you definitely know who this guy was, because among these communities, he is a legend. Now, what makes a legend can be tricky as hell, but in this man's case, it was probably a combination of character and circumstance. And that circumstance happened on the night of the 25th of September, 1925, when the U.S. submarine S-51 was accidentally rammed by the merchant steamer City of Rome, 12 nautical miles south of Newport, Rhode Island. Now, 3 of the crew were rescued by the City of Rome as they escaped out the terrific tear on the side of the S-51's hull in just the first moments of the sinking. And one of the first Navy ships on scene was a sister submarine, the S-1, commanded by a 29-year-old Lieutenant Charles Momsen. Now, all he and his men found was an oil slick, the lifeblood of a submarine that was now down at the bottom of the ocean, only 130 feet below. This was the moment that defined Charles Bowers Momsen, as he realized that the rest of the crew of the S-51, even if they were alive and trapped down below, were lost, and there wasn't a damn thing he or anyone else could do about it. Of the S-51's complement, only those lucky 3 survived. The remaining 35 officers and men were lost, with no chance of escape or rescue. Now, this didn't make Momsen a legend, but it started him on the path. Now, submarines of that day could be dangerous affairs. Every time they went subsurface, there was always a chance that they would never come back up. But as submarine technology improved, that chance of failure became smaller and smaller. But it has never really gone away. Submarines then as now control their depth by 2 methods. The first by ballast tanks. On the surface, these tanks are full of air, giving the submarine the buoyancy it needs to stay on the surface. Submarines could vent the air from these tanks and flood them with seawater. This would make the submarine negatively buoyant, and it would start to sink. By controlling the ratio of air and water in these tanks, the captain of a submarine could control his depth. Now, the second method, which worked in coordination with ballast tanks, were the dive planes. Most submarines of the day had dive planes on the bow and stern of their boat. By controlling the angle of these dive planes, you could force the bow at a downward angle, pointing it in the direction of the depth you wanted to obtain, much like the elevators on an airplane. By working in concert with the ballast tanks, a submarine could precisely control its depth. If your dive planes jammed, then your ballast tanks could overcome them and force you to the surface anyway. If you had a problem with your ballast tanks, your dive planes might help you to the surface, assuming your speed was high enough. If these systems failed, or you had any kind of flooding, then it was a desperate race to fix both these issues and try to reach the surface. The hard reality was that if your sub went down, unless you were outrageously lucky, you were doomed. Now, all submarines have what is called an operating depth, or a test depth. It is the deepest depth that a submarine can routinely and safely dive. For the S-51, that was 200 feet, which was 40 feet shorter than the total length of that submarine. They also had what was called a crush depth, and that's the calculated depth that a submarine's hull could be expected to implode from the terrific pressure of the water at that depth. This was often an estimate, and there were numerous instances during World War II where submarines exceeded their crush depth and still survived. Of course, we only hear about the ones that survived. Another critical issue for a survival in a stricken submarine was how deep was the seabed. If it was your crush depth or deeper, then it was most likely over. But if you hit bottom before your hull collapsed, then you might still be alive. Except back then, it didn't matter if you survived in a watertight compartment. You would eventually asphyxiate as the air became either saturated with carbon dioxide or you ran out of breathable oxygen. As a submariner, Momsen fully understood the reality of all these issues, but it wasn't something he could just accept. He knew that any survivors on a stricken sub had no way to leave the submarine and surface on their own. He knew that there was no way for anybody on the surface to go down and get them. The only real option was sending divers down to attach cables in an attempt to lift the entire submarine. But this option took too long, and it also required good weather a submarine at a reasonable depth, numerous hardhat dives, multiple cranes, miles of cables, pontoons, miles of air hoses, compressors, and literally days and more likely weeks and even months of work. Days that any survivor simply didn't have, as they would either run out of breathable air or succumb to the pressures of the deep. The only available option was neither quick nor easy, and time was the most critical aspect, as the lifetime of any surviving crew in a sunken submarine was measured in mere hours, not days, and certainly not weeks. Nevertheless, Momsen began to figure out ways for submariners to get out of their stricken submarines on their own, and how those on the surface might be able to go down and get them. Charles Bowers Momsen entered the Naval Academy in 1914, which would have made him the class of 1918, except that near the end of his first year there was a huge cheating scandal among the midshipmen. Because of that, the next fall, in his second year, the Academy made the examinations that much tougher, and Swede, his new nickname, bestowed by his classmates, just barely failed his Spanish test. Momsen, along with 300 other midshipmen, were out of the Academy. And just to show the gumption, and yes, that's an old man term and it means balls, just to show the gumption that Swede had, he pursued reappointment. Then as now, you got into the military academies because you were sponsored by a senator or a congressman. He'd gotten his first appointment through his Republican congressman, but now his congressman was a Democrat and not likely to support his appointment, as Momsen's father was a big GOP supporter. Nevertheless, Momsen did not give up, and his new congressman relented and finally gave him a second appointment. Bonus points for this Democrat. Because of the Great War, aka World War I, Swede attended an accelerated academic schedule, and even though he repeated his plebe year, he graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1919, just 3 years. His first assignment was to the battleship USS Oklahoma, but in 1921 he volunteered for and attended the Naval Submarine School in New London, Connecticut. Within 2 years, he had his first command, the USS O-15, hull number SS-76. This was back in the day when submarines had just a number and a letter designation instead of a name. Fun fact, they also didn't have flushing toilets. That's right, they did their business in a bucket filled with fuel oil. It was a few years later that he commanded the USS S-1 and responded to the S-51 disaster, and then began to try to solve the two problems of a downed submarine: how men could escape on their own, and how teams on the surface could go down and rescue any survivors. Now, his first idea was a diving bell, and diving bells were not new ideas and had been around for hundreds of years, but he was trying to design a bell which could be lowered to a sunken submarine and securely attached to one of the escape trunks, where it would equalize the pressure that was the interior of the submarine, allowing the hatch to be opened and the crew to be taken to the surface in the bell. He spent a great deal of time developing and hammering out the details of this idea and discussing it with his fellow submarine commanders. He wrote it up in a package and took it to his New London-based commander, Captain Ernest J. King. King thought it was the best idea for a rescue device he'd ever heard of and endorsed it, and they sent it off to the submarine division of the Bureau of Construction and Repair. Now, Swede did not realize that he was now dealing with the most difficult and underhanded enemies he would ever encounter. This enemy was the bureaucracy. One thing you must understand about bureaucracy is that you might be able to overcome it, you might be able to circumvent it, but it can never be defeated. And that's because the bureaucracy is a power unto itself and not a servant of the warfighters, as you might naively expect. And even if you should overcome the dragon that is the bureaucracy, it will find a way to get you back and put you in your place. Swede Momsen, however, didn't know this at the time, so he sent off his diving bell proposal with the absolute best of intentions. So he waited, and he waited some more, and after a year he figured there must have been something wrong with his idea, but no one ever reached out to him, so he didn't know. That is, until he came up for his next assignment and found himself posted to the actual lair of the beast, the Bureau of Construction and Repair. He shows up for work, and no one mentions the diving bell package he had sent in. Later that day, he finds his packet, just as he had sent it, at the bottom of a stack of papers. Nobody had done anything about it. So he takes the packet around and he tries to get it looked at by all the experts there. And after a few weeks, he finds it back on his desk marked impractical from a point of seamanship. This is the horseshit that is bureaucracy. This was Swede Momsen's rude awakening, and he never forgot this lesson. This is also when he began to not give a shit about the bureaucracy. Then came the loss of another submarine. The USS S4 was surfacing off Provincetown, Massachusetts on 27 December 1927 when she was accidentally rammed by the United States Coast Guard destroyer Paulding. The Paulding immediately stopped and lowered lifeboats, but all that remained of the sub was a small amount of oil and air bubbles rising to the surface. Against all odds, they heard tapping from below and learned there were 6 survivors trapped 100 feet down in the forward torpedo room. A massive effort was quickly underway to rescue these men in terrifically bad weather, including sending divers down to attach an air hose, an effort that almost got a diver killed who got entangled in the wreckage and who had to be rescued by a second diver. All this effort was to no avail as the tapping from the forward torpedo room slowly stopped after 3 days. The entire crew perished. It was this incident that motivated Momsen to work on what he called the submarine escape lung. This escape lung idea came from a patent by a little-known genius, Henry Floyce, a British diving engineer and master diver back in the late 1800s. Yeah, so balls of steel for this guy. In fact, German submarines at this time had a device called the Tauchretter as a standard issue for their submariners. So the idea was not new, but Momsen, now a qualified Navy diver, was trying to get one for the U.S. Navy. The problem that Momsen set to solve was how to do a buoyant ascent from depth without killing the submariner, and dying during this ascent turned out to be ridiculously easy. The problem was that every 33 feet down in seawater, the pressure increases by 1 atmosphere. That means if you had a gallon jug of air at the surface and took it down to 33 feet, you would find the jug compressed to half its original volume. More important, if you inhaled compressed air at 33 feet, then held your breath while you swam to the surface, you could too easily cause an air embolism where the air in your lungs would rupture through the lining of your lungs and cause catastrophic injuries that often resulted in death. So a sailor escaping from his submarine at 100 feet is breathing in 3 atmospheres of pressurized air that will expand in his lungs to 3 times its normal volume, almost guaranteeing a dead sailor. So what you had to do was to make sure you exhaled all the way up. But of course, you could expend all your air doing that, and then you would pass out and drown. Momsen took his design, built a prototype, and then tested it. He figured out what worked and what needed improvement and continually modified his design. His divers were there with him, testing right alongside him, though Swede would always be the first to try out a new modification or take it to a deeper depth. He was that kind of a lead from the front officer, and it earned deep respect from his divers. Finally, after he completed a test from 200 feet underwater, he was confident in his final design, and the submarine escape lung was approved and adopted by the U.S. Navy. Yep, sometimes the bureaucracy actually works. Except the newspapers called it the Momsen lung. This name pissed off the faceless bureaucrats at the Bureau of Construction and Repair, probably because Momsen was doing their job for them and way better than they could ever do it. Surprisingly, lazy, incompetent people don't like their lazy incompetence to be highlighted for all to see. Momsen's submarine escape lung consisted of a breathing bag held at chest level, with a small canister of oxygen for breathing and another canister of absorbent to filter out the CO2. The sailor would wear a nose clip and a mouthpiece with 2 tubes on each side, one for inhaling and the second for exhaling. First problem solved. In 1930, Momsen began to focus on his diving bell, which had all kinds of problems, as it was a much more complicated device. He didn't give up and consistently improved the design with constant tests and evaluations until he was called to return to the Bureau of Construction and Repair to teach sailors how to use his Momsen lung. He left his diving bell in the capable hands of Lieutenant Commander Al McCann, who oversaw the final changes to the diving bell that would make it operational. McCann completed it in late 1930 and the bureaucracy immediately named it the McCann Submarine Rescue Chamber, just to thumb Momsen in the eye. Well, Swede Momsen never blinked because he thought that McCann was a fantastic diving officer. Then came the crisis for which Swede Momsen had been preparing for most of his life. On 23 May 1939, the USS Squalus, a brand new Sargo-class submarine, failed to report in after a scheduled test dive off of Portsmouth Naval Yard on Seaveys Island in Kittery, Maine. The USS Squalus, under the command of Lieutenant Oliver Naquin, had been doing test dives as part of the boat's shakedown. As she began to do her normal dive operations with the Christmas tree showing green, meaning all pertinent valves were closed, the crew in the control room felt a sudden and very unusual blast of air. Then the telephone talker interrupted what had been a very smooth dive with the call that the engine room reported massive flooding. Lieutenant Naquin immediately ordered surface by blowing all main ballast. This would fill the ballast tanks with air, forcing seawater out, hopefully giving the Squalus the buoyancy it needed to counteract the flooding. The submarine was probably about 50 feet down, began to actually head back to the surface, and might have even broached the surface before she lost all of her forward momentum and began to slide backward as the flooding in the after compartments was simply too great to overcome. Crewmen were trying to rush forward from the flooded rear compartments into the control room, while electrician's mate third class Lloyd MAAS held the hatch open for them. This was a difficult situation to be in, for the longer he held the door open, the more shipmates might escape, but if he wasn't able to close it, then the entire sub could be lost. When he saw no more crewmen in the rising waters of the forward engine room, he managed a superhuman effort to pull a 300-pound-plus hatch upwards against the down angle of the stern and dog the hatch watertight. The captain and his crew could do nothing to stop the downward plunge of the Squalus until she hit bottom at 243 feet. The captain found that only 33 of his crew of 59 men could be confirmed alive. Most of the known survivors were in the control room, while the rest had been further forward in either the battery room or the forward torpedo room. As the initial flooding coming through the ventilation system had hit the batteries in the battery room, Chief Electrician's mate Lawrence Gaynor had crawled down into the battery well under the deck and reached down through the blue electric arcs to shut them off. But batteries back then could give off deadly chlorine gas when they became wet, so Captain Naquin had all the men in the battery compartment move into the forward torpedo room, and they closed the hatches between them. Naquin guessed that all of his crewmen in the two engine rooms had not survived the massive flooding, but he held up hope that the crew in the after torpedo room might have survived, despite no contact with the telephone talker in the after torpedo room. Naquin also guessed that the culprit of the entire disaster must have been the main induction valve, a 31-inch wide valve that fed fresh air from the conning tower on deck while surfaced to her four 1,600 horsepower diesel engines that powered the Squalus on the surface and recharged her batteries. The only problem was that the Christmas tree had indicated that the main induction valve had been closed for the dive. Somehow it opened and caused the catastrophic flooding in the engine room. Naquin had one of his crew load and fire a red smoke rocket from the control room and then order the forward torpedo room to release the marker buoy to the surface. This yellow buoy was marked with "Sunk Submarine Here" and telephone inside, and contained a handset and a line down to the submarine. It was also the first time this new device had been used on a submarine. The captain knew that within an hour of him failing to report by radio, the entire base would be alerted. He considered using the Momsen longs, but held off on that course of action, intending to use it only as a last resort, as trying a buoyant ascent from 243 feet down in the cold 35-degree Atlantic could be deadly. The reality was that in the entire history of the Momsen long, only 5 sailors successfully used one to escape from their submarine. This happened much later during World War II, when a U.S. submarine was sunk by Japanese depth charges. 15 men made the escape attempt, 10 made it to the surface, but 5 were lost there on the surface, drifting away from the group, with the last 5 being taken prisoner by the Japanese Navy. This was not an issue of poor design, for the U.S. Navy still uses and trains on a more modernized version, but rather it was inherently dangerous as you were doing it from a sunken submarine, meaning you were already in a life and death situation, and you were taking a chance doing a very difficult and dangerous buoyant ascent with too many factors such as depth, darkness, current, freezing temperatures, and departing from a wrecked submarine, each increasing the danger and still requiring the sailor to remain calm and focused, because the slightest panic would cause you to hold your breath and start swimming for the surface, a guaranteed death sentence. Years ago, when I attended a military dive school, we did one buoyant ascent from a submarine lockout chamber attached to the bottom of a 50-foot water tower. Our instructors emphasized the danger of this event, and all of us students were doing this with only a life vest and a mask. When we swam out of the escape trunk to the bottom of the tower, we found an instructor in scuba gear waiting to ascend with us to ensure that each of us was blowing a steady stream of bubbles all the way to the surface. This dive tank had a decompression chamber at the top of the tower, so if there were any injuries, real or suspected, they could immediately take that student and recompress them down to depth. When Rear Admiral Cyrus W. Cole, the commander of the Portsmouth Navy Yard, learned that the USS Squalus was overdue, his first call was to Lieutenant Commander Momsen, who is now commander of the Navy's Experimental Dive Unit at the Washington Naval Yard. A plane was made available, and Momsen brought his two dive medical officers, Lieutenants Albert Benke and Oscar Yarborough, and one of his master divers, Chief Metalsmith Jim McDonald. Then Admiral Cole ordered the USS Sculpin, a sister submarine of the Squalus, out to the dive coordinates to see what she could find. When Lieutenant Warren Wilkins, the skipper of the Sculpin, reached the last known position of the Squalus, he found nothing. No oil slick, no rescue buoy, no debris, nothing. Little did he know that they were actually 5 miles off. An error of transcription for the latitude and longitude had been 1 digit wrong, making for a 5-mile error. The Squalus on the bottom had been sending up red smoke rockets at intervals. These rockets, when they reached the surface, would launch into the air and then explode at about 80 feet with a puff of red smoke. But these rockets were going off 5 miles away through the haze and just out of sight of the Sculpin, who was heading along Squalus's expected dive track and actually moving farther away from the downed submarine. Just when the Squalus fired off their 6th rocket, Lieutenant Edwin Denby on the Sculpin happened to look in the right direction, and off in the distance he thought he saw a faint puff of red smoke. The Sculpin immediately did a 180, went to full speed in that direction, and soon found the yellow marker buoy, and were able to call down to the Squalus and confirm there were survivors, except that a Sculpin crewman tied off the telephone line to a cleat on the deck, and when a wave rose the sub high enough, the line parted at the very beginning of a conversation with Captain Wilkins and Captain Acklin. Nevertheless, they had confirmed that the Squalus was down and that there were survivors. The exact number remained unknown to those on the surface, along with the exact location of the Squalus. For Admiral Cole, the news of the Sculpin locating the rescue buoy only confirmed his worst fears. The Squalus was indeed down. Then the news that the line had parted was even worse. The one contact with the lost sub was gone. The line that could lead a diver down to the Squalus irretrievably lost. Admiral Cole, now aboard the yard tug Pinnacook, departed for the site, but the tug's top speed was only 7 knots. The Sculpin, meanwhile, had immediately dropped a buoy to mark the closest spot to the downed Squalus. Her sonar was only able to give an approximate location of the Squalus, so when the Pinnacook arrived, Admiral Cole had the Pinnacook drop marker buoys 100 yards north and south of the Sculpin's original buoy. The number of ships, both Navy and Coast Guard, responding to this emergency grew by the hour and included the light cruiser U.S.S. Brooklyn, the seagoing tugs Wyandank and Sagamore, and several Coast Guard cutters and patrol boats, and the rescue tug Falcon with her tested but untried rescue chamber. Above the Squalus, Chief Ullman, commander of the Pinnacook, was dragging a grapnel line across the bottom in an attempt to snag the Squalus. His attempts were unsuccessful, and he feared his grapnel was just too light to reach the bottom. Admiral Cole ordered the Pinnacook to use one of Sculpin's spare anchors in hopes that a heavier grapnel would work. Finally, just before dark, Chief Ullman's grapnel snagged something and did not slip off. They set a buoy and hoped that they had hooked the Squalus. The Wandang was able to send very clear Morse code signals via their oscilloscope to the Squalus, but the crew that hammered a response back to the surface were either barely heard or heard not at all. Wandang signaled that they believed they had successfully hooked a grapnel to the Squalus, but neither Lieutenant Naquin nor his surviving crew had heard or felt a thing. What everyone feared was that the Pennacook had hooked something else entirely. About that same time, Lieutenant Seymour Johnson, the pilot flying Momsen, managed a successful landing in bad weather on the Piscataqua River next to Portsmouth. Momsen and his men immediately boarded a Coast Guard cutter for the trip out to the Squalus site. They arrived just before 2300 hours. Admiral Cole, now aboard the Sculpin, brought Momsen up to speed. The rest of Momsen's Naval Experimental Dive Unit divers had been forced down by bad weather in Newport, Rhode Island. The Falcon rescue ship, with the rescue chamber and its own complements of hard hat divers, would arrive in about 6 hours. Cole immediately put Momsen in charge of all rescue operations. Lieutenant Naquin, before the marker buoy line had parted, had passed the recommendation up that the aft compartments be pumped out so that the Squalus could regain her buoyancy. Cole thought this a great idea, but Momsen laid out the complicated difficulties of sending divers down to attach multiple hoses in 240 feet of water. Momsen declared that these men were either going to come up on their own with a Momsen lung or they were going to go down and get them with the McCann rescue bell. Now, Momsen himself had supervised the construction of a 100-foot dive tower at the U.S. Navy Submarine School, and over 1,000 sailors had successfully completed buoyant ascents with the Momsen lung, except that there had recently been 2 deaths in only 18 feet of water. So now Momsen was wondering what he might have overlooked in all the testing of his escape device. To Momsen, the tested and certified but never used rescue bell was the best solution for the Squalus sinking. At 0400 the next morning, the U.S.S. Falcon arrived on the scene. By 0945, in rising swells and amid frequent squalls, the Falcon finally established a 4-point mooring above the suspected site of the Squalus, and Momsen could send down his first diver. Now, divers of that day were some tough sons of bitches. You had to be to survive dive school and conduct the kind of dives they did back then. The dive gear of that era was close to 200 pounds of equipment, including the iconic and massive Mark V helmet and breastplate that weighed 55 pounds all by itself. Divers wore a suit that weighed 30 pounds, shoes that weighed 17 pounds each, and a weight belt that could be 80 pounds or more. These divers were supplied by air from the surface and had communications gear and even new electrically heated underwear. This system was built by that same Bureau of Construction Repair back in 1916, and the U.S. Navy used the Mark V helmet until 1984, the year I went into the Navy. 68 operational years for this design shows you how good it was. For the first dive, Momsen selected a 6'4" bosun's mate, second class and first class diver by the name of Martin Sabitsky. Now, Sabitsky was an experienced diver, but he wasn't the most experienced diver. That would have probably been Master Diver Chief Metalsmith Jim McDonald, who had flown down to Portsmouth with Commander Momsen, or Chief Machinist Mate and Master Diver Bill Batters. But there was a reason behind Momsen's choice, and it had everything to do with Sabitsky, for he was a diver whose career was in serious jeopardy. Just a few months earlier, Sabitsky had suffered a serious attack of the bends during a relatively shallow dive, and the Navy's recommended response was the worst thing for a diver: disqualification. Momsen knew Sabitsky very well, and that dive just didn't make sense to him. So he did a little investigating on his own and realized that Sabitsky had probably been deeper than anyone realized. So Momsen took a risk by sending Sabitsky down, and hopefully saving his career as a diver. Sabitsky knew his diving future was hanging by a thread, but he was extremely grateful to Lieutenant Commander Momsen for this dive. He suited up and prepared to go. Sabitsky was slowly lowered and maintained direct communication with Momsen the entire time. Then came the best news all had hoped for. The Pennacook had indeed snagged the Squalus with the grappling line, and Sabitsky found himself on the forward deck of the Squalus, only 6 feet from the forward escape hatch, exactly where he needed to be. Chief Ullman, commander of the Pennacook, had pulled off an epic piece of seamanship. Now Sabitsky's job was to attach the downhaul cable from the surface to a ring on the hatch of the escape trunk. This would be used by the rescue chamber to guide it directly to the escape hatch. One of the biggest problems that Sabitsky and all divers have to deal with is caused by that inert, ever-present gas called nitrogen, which makes up about 78% of the air we breathe. Oxygen makes up almost 21%, 20.9% to be exact. The rest of air is made up of multiple gases, including argon, just under 1%, carbon dioxide, a variable gas that averages about 0.03%, and all of these other gases have little to no effect on us at the surface, but nitrogen begins to have issues when breathed under pressure. The first issue is that it begins to dissolve into your bloodstream and is absorbed into your tissues. If you come up too fast from a dive, or if it is a deeper dive and you do not make the decompression safety stops, then that dissolved nitrogen will come out of solution too quickly, and instead of being slowly expelled by your lungs, forms bubbles in your tissues, causing tremendous pain that can be crippling and even cause death. To prevent this, the U.S. Navy follows very specific dive tables that, if followed, can reduce this danger to almost nil. Now, the crew of the Squalus had pressure gauges and knew that they were at 243 feet down, but also knew that the pressure inside the forward compartments was 12.5 psi, pounds per square inch, higher than at the surface, meaning the crew was at the equivalent of breathing compressed air at about 28 feet underwater. Were they to try to the escape trunk and the Momsen lungs for their escape, the pressure in the trunk would have to equalize to 240 feet before they could open the hatch and swim out and start ascending to the surface. There, the pressure would be nearly 107 psi, or over 7 atmospheres, meaning the air in their lung would expand 7 times its original volume. This is what Martin Sabitsky had to deal with when he was attaching the downhaul cable to the escape hatch. But that wasn't the most dangerous issue he had to deal with. That would be nitrogen narcosis. When a diver reaches about 99 feet, or 3 atmosphere, the nitrogen in his body has a narcotic effect, almost exactly like having too many alcoholic drinks. A diver could become euphoric, careless, morose, completely lose track of his job, and lose all concept about the danger he was actually in. Doing the simplest tasks becomes enormously difficult and requires tremendous discipline and concentration. One of the crazy things about this is that divers that drank a lot often could perform slightly better under the symptoms of nitrogen narcosis. Cuss like a sailor, drink like a diver. It became standard procedure for every diver to repeat every command or instruction he received, and then tell the surface exactly what he was doing and what he planned to do. On the forward deck of the Squalus, Sabitsky found the parted telephone buoy marker cable had fallen across the escape hatch and the large steel collar around it, and knew that it would interfere with the rescue bell making a seal against that collar. He got on his hands and knees and cleared that, and the Falcon began to lower the downhaul cable. Sabitsky also stomped on the hatch to let the trapped crew know he was there, but the crew had heard him walking around on deck since he had first arrived. One man in the escape trunk could even hear Sabitsky talking, but couldn't make out the words. The Falcon lowered the downhaul cable with the shackle tied to the grapnel line that Sabitsky had used on his descent. Sabitsky cut the marlin line holding the shackle, then cursed himself as he lost the shackle and it swung away into the murk. Falcon retrieved it and sent it back down. Sabitsky spent 22 minutes on the deck of the Squalus and successfully attached the downhaul's cable to the ring in the middle of the escape hatch. Now, based on the dive tables, Sabitsky would have to spend time decompressing. His first stop was at 90 feet, back on the platform, where he would only stay for a few minutes. Then they would raise him to 80 feet for a few minutes more, then 70 for a longer period, then 60 for even longer. All of his decompression stops together would equal 146 minutes underwater. So the Navy's solution was a bit of genius. Once the diver reached 50 feet, they would haul him quickly out of the water, undress him from all of his diving gear, and put him in the decompression chamber with one of the dive doctors, and then recompress him down to 50 feet. Then he would be brought up safely in the chamber following the dive tables. So this is what they did with Sabitsky, and even still, his time decompressing in the water between 90 and 60 feet took 42 minutes. When he got to 50 feet, they hauled him up, threw him in the chamber, where he stayed for another hour and 45 minutes as they went through the stops at 50, 40, 30, 20, and then 10 feet. First class diver Martin Sabitsky's dive had been completely successful. Well, that's a lie. His dive had been completely epic. While Sabitsky was still on the platform making his decompression stops, the rescue chamber was put into the water. The weather forecast was poor, and it wouldn't take much bad weather to force the chamber out of the water and back on deck. Momsen was figuring it would take 5 trips to rescue the 33 survivors. With 2 men operating the rescue chamber, he figured 4 trips of 7 men, 9 totals each ascent, and the last 5 survivors in the final 5th trip. In the end, Momsen decided to try for 4 total, knowing that the weather could delay or cancel trips, which would put the last men at tremendous risk. The air was barely breathable on the Squalus, even though Lieutenant Naquin would periodically spread soda lime on the deck to absorb CO2 and release fresh oxygen from compressed tanks. The captain of the Squalus was trying to make the breathable air last as long as humanly possible. Momsen planned to test his chamber passenger capacity by bringing 7 survivors up in the first ascent, and if that worked, to bring 8 in the second and then 9 in each of the last 2. But it would all depend on how well the rescue chamber operated on each trip. It was near noon when the rescue chamber was hoisted off the deck and lowered over the side into the water, with Martin Sabitsky still in the water doing his decompression stops. The McCann rescue chamber was about 10 feet high, 7 feet wide, and weighed nearly 10 tons. And though it had undergone numerous tests and was certified by the U.S. Navy, it had never conducted a real rescue, nor had it ever gone this deep in testing. It was held by an uphaul cable and had 2 air hoses, one for supply, one for exhaust, and 1 electrical hose to provide power for a telephone and interior lights. Inside were the first 2 operators, Walt Harmon and John Michalowski, Navy divers and chamber operators set to attempt the very first rescue. On Momsen's command, they closed the top hatch, and the rescue chamber began to descend. The Wandang signaled to the Squalus crew that the chamber was on its way down and to prepare 7 men for the first trip to the surface. 30 minutes later, at 150 feet, the rescue chamber stopped with trouble in the air vent in keeping the pressure adjusted to maintain a constantly changing buoyancy. The problem was fixed in 3 minutes, and the descent continued until Michalowski, looking through the viewport, reported submarine in sight. The chamber slowly rested on the steel collar surrounding the forward escape hatch, and then Harmon began the process of blowing ballast and flooding the lower compartment in the chamber, forcing the chamber tighter to the deck of the Squalus. When the seal was complete, Michalowski opened the inner hatch that connected the 2 compartments of the rescue chamber. Now he stood in several inches of water on the deck of the Squalus and attached 4 long steel bolts to rings around the sub's hatch that would secure the chamber to the sub. That done, Michalowski could open the top hatch of the submarine. This hatch led into the escape trunk, and though it was empty, the bottom hatch soon opened, and for the first time, the submariners saw the chamber operators. Michalowski passed down hot coffee, sandwiches, soup, and blankets. The first group of 7 men climbed into the rescue chamber and included 1 civilian technician, 5 enlisted men, and 1 officer. Detaching from the submarine took nearly 15 minutes, and the ascent took another 37 minutes. When the chamber reached the surface, it was quickly pulled to the side of the Falcon, and the first group of survivors were helped out of the chamber and onto the deck. The time was 13:42. The first group of survivors had been trapped in the submarine for 29 hours. As they watched the men climb out of the chamber, the mood among all the other sailors was electric. For the first time in history, men had been rescued from a watery grave. One officer spoke to Lieutenant Commander Momsen, asking him how he could be so calm at this moment of triumph. In truth, it was the most exciting moment of Momsen's life. Below in the Squalus, Lieutenant Naquin prepared to vacate the control room and move into the forward torpedo room. Because all would have to pass through the forward battery room to get to the torpedo room, he worried about the chlorine gas threat from the wet batteries. Naquin had his men prepare and wear their Momsen lungs while moving through the battery room to protect them from the deadly gas. Naquin also told Chief Gaynor, the senior officer in the forward torpedo room, to have all his men don their Momsen lungs too, to protect them from any chlorine gas that might seep into the torpedo room when the crew from the control room entered. Naquin was the last to leave the control room, and while he was in the forward battery room, he opened the hatch to the batteries, and sure enough, his flashlight picked up a thick greenish cloud that began to rise to him. He quickly shut the hatch. On the Falcon, Momsen replaced Michalowski with Chief Machinist Mate Bill Batters for the rescue chamber's second trip down to the Squalus. Now the plan was to bring 8 men up, one more than the first trip. But the rescue chamber's clutch failed to engage on the downhaul line, and the entire chamber had to be hauled on deck to fix it. That only took a few minutes, and a little after 1500 hours, Harmon reported that the chamber was bolted to the Squalus. Captain Naquin selected the next men to ride up in the chamber, his men waiting patiently for him to choose. None tried to catch his eye or put themselves forward for the next trip. When the chamber surfaced from its second trip, Momsen immediately saw a problem. The chamber was riding very low in the water, and that told him that 8 passengers, along with the 2 operators, was the maximum load for the rescue chamber. This meant that for the 18 survivors still below, Momsen would have to perform 3 more trips instead of the 2 he was hoping for. This was bad news because the weather was worsening and could too easily become bad enough that the rescue operation would have to be put on hold. There were too many things that could go wrong with high winds and waves. The Falcon's anchors could start to drag, the bulky clutch on the chamber could fail, and the lines down to the sub could part. Momsen replaced Harmon with Michalowski and told them 8 men. That's it. The clutch had problems again, but finally engaged, and soon the chamber was on the Squalus, and the seal was complete, and the third group of survivors began to climb through the escape trunk into the rescue chamber. Then Commander Roy Sackett, an officer on the bow of the Falcon, observing the second group of survivors wrapped in blankets and drinking coffee, realized that things weren't adding up. He rushed to the stern to tell Momsen that there had been 9 men on the last trip, not 8. This was huge news for Momsen, who immediately called down to Chief Batters to belay the order of 8 men and bring 9 men instead. This, it turned out, would make all the difference. Momsen assigned Jim McDonald and Michalowski as the rescue chamber operators for the 4th and final trip. Momsen hoped the final survivors would be rescued by 2100 hours, which couldn't happen too soon, as it was getting dark and starting to rain. Momsen based his timing because each descent down had taken about an hour, with about 45 minutes attached to the Squalus, and another 30 minutes ascending meant that about a 2-hour and 15-minute round trip. Below on the Squalus remained Lieutenant Naquin, his XO, Lieutenant Doyle, and 6 enlisted men. As the chamber departed the surface and began its descent, the problem clutch worked without a hitch. The ride down was the smoothest yet, and McDonald reported exactly 1 hour later that they were opening the hatch to the Squalus. Captain Naquin was the last to enter the rescue chamber, and the hatches were closed, and the chamber began its ascent. At about 160 feet, the chamber came to a dead stop, and McDonald reported that the downhaul cable was jammed on the reel. Then the air motor that operated the reel quit, and neither McDonald nor Michalowski could get it started again. Momsen ordered the chamber to flood main ballast, and the retrieving wire was lowered along with the chamber until it was nearly back on the Squalus. Nothing could fix the fouled downhaul cable except putting a diver into the water. Chief Torpedoman Walter Squire went over the side at just after 2100 hours. He rode the same line that Sabitsky had traveled. Squire was to unshackle the cable from the ring on the Squalus escape hatch, the very same cable that Sabitsky had attached on that first dive. But it was too tight, and he couldn't get enough slack to release it. So they sent down some heavy wire cutters. Working against the debilitating nitrogen narcosis, Chief Squire finally managed to cut the downhaul. As they brought him up, He could see that the cut downhaul line had freed the chamber so that it was swinging under the retrieving line and actually brushing against the side of the conning tower. Now the chamber could be hauled up with the retrieving wire, and the only problem was keeping it slightly negatively buoyant so it wouldn't be too heavy to haul up. The danger here was that if it became slightly positively buoyant, it would start rising faster than they were hauling, could broach surface, tip over, lose all the air in the ballast tanks, and then rocket to the bottom again, killing everyone on board. The ascent was conducted at a steady 5 feet per minute, and those on the Falcon watched as the cable came out of the sea, only to find that the individual steel strands were coming apart right in front of them. What Momsen didn't know was that the cable hadn't been long enough in the first place, so it had been spliced together to make it long enough, and one of those splices had failed. Momsen immediately had the rescue chamber lowered to the bottom to relieve the weight on the retrieving line. Both Momsen and McCann knew what needed to happen next. Another diver had to be sent down to attach a new retrieving wire. That diver was Torpedoman First Class Jesse Duncan. As they lowered him down to attach a new line, he became entangled in the rescue chamber's lines. He worked so hard to get himself untangled that he came into another problem. Divers call it smoke, or inhaling more carbon dioxide than his suit could handle. Duncan then reported nearly the worst news possible. The cable had frayed so much that it was hanging by only a single strand of steel wire. That single strand was the width of a piece of string. Suddenly Duncan became incoherent, a sure sign of what modern divers would call a CO2 hit. He was quickly hauled up and put in the recompression chamber. Momsen had no other choice. He had to send down another diver, and that diver was Metalsmith First Class Ed Clayton. To make it easier for Clayton to work, they sent down a 1,000-watt underwater lamp on a separate line. However, during his descent, the lamp got entangled in the frayed section of the retrieving line, and Clayton lost his light source. Clayton worked for nearly 30 minutes in the dark on top of the rescue chamber trying to attach a new retrieving line. Momsen could hear the despair in his voice and knew that Clayton was close to blacking out. He gave the order, and a despairing Clayton began his ascent. It was a long ascent, for Clayton couldn't be put in the chamber once he reached 50 feet, as Duncan was already in it. So instead, he stood on the platform, numb with cold, as Momsen planned his next move. Putting another diver down was now out of the question. If neither Duncan or Clayton could do it, two of the most experienced divers the Navy had, then it couldn't be done. Instead, Momsen planned to have the chamber operators blow air until it became light enough for the men on the surface to pull the retrieving line by hand. Momsen knew the human touch would be lighter and more sensitive than a crane, and reduce the chance of breaking that last strand of wire. He ordered Michalowski to blow ballast for 15 seconds. Then he, McCann, and 8 more men on deck hauled on the retrieving line. Nothing. It didn't budge. 15 seconds more of blowing ballast, and they hauled again. Still nothing. He did it 15 seconds again, knowing he was getting dangerously close to making the chamber positively buoyant. Still no give. Finally, she began to slowly rise, and the men on deck, working with the rising swells, hauled smoothly and carefully. When enough of the retrieving line was hauled out, they could all see the frayed portion, indeed only a single strand remaining. Once they got past the fray, the men hauling had no worries about the line breaking. Finally, as the chamber neared the surface, it passed Clayton, still on his dive platform, decompressing at 40 feet. As cold as he was, he nearly jumped for joy when he saw the lights of the chamber slowly rise past him. The rescue chamber reached the surface, and the last survivors were pulled out. They had been stuck in the bell for nearly 6 hours. Except maybe there were more survivors. The chances were very low, but they had to determine if there were any survivors in the aft torpedo room. Captain Naquin and his men had heard nothing from any of the telephone talkers in any of the compartments after the control room. It was highly doubtful there were any survivors in the engine rooms, but there was at least some slight hope that there might be survivors in the aft torpedo room, for it too had an escape hatch. During the night, new downhaul cables were installed on the rescue chamber, and a new retrieving cable was attached to the top of the chamber. Lieutenant Julian Morrison, a diver from the USS Falcon, was the next diver down. Once on deck, he cut the manila grapnel line from the Squalus' port railing and pulled it as he walked past the conning tower to the after part of the sub and reattached it near the aft escape hatch. Warrant Officer William Barton was the next diver down, but he couldn't clear his ears and was pulled back up. Finally, Boatswain Mate First Class James Baker made the next dive and successfully attached the downhaul cable to the aft torpedo room escape hatch. Now the rescue chamber was ready for its fifth trip. Chief Batters and First Class Petty Officer Michalowski were the operators and fully understood how dangerous this last one was if the aft torpedo room turned out to be flooded. They would be attempting to get a seal on a chamber that was effectively at 240 feet of pressure, vice the 28 feet of pressure that was the forward torpedo room. It would be the 4 long bolts at the bottom of the rescue chamber that they would attach to the submarine that would provide their only safety net. Plus, once they were locked onto the submarine, the pressure valves for receiving fresh air from the surface would have to be closed in order to maintain the lock. That meant that the CO2 they exhaled could build up to dangerous levels, and they must operate quickly. Momsen gave them a 20-minute limit once they sealed to the Squalus and opened the hatch to the after torpedo room. The descent was similar to previous ones, and once they were on the hatch, Batters climbed down onto the deck of the Squalus and attached all the safety bolts. Once that was done, he slowly, carefully began to open the escape hatch. Suddenly he was hit with a blast of air and the bottom of the chamber began flooding. Batters called for more pressure and Michalowski reacted swiftly and adjusted the pressure so the water stopped rising and then began to recede. Then Batters was able to open the hatch all the way, only to find that the after torpedo room was completely flooded. They reported it to the surface and Momsen ordered them to come up. They had been down for 17 minutes. The rescue operation was over. Of the crew of 59 men, 26 had perished in the initial sinking, including 2 civilian technicians there to observe the dive. But 33 had been rescued, and this was huge news across the entire country and the world. It remains the only time the McCann rescue bell ever successfully pulled survivors from a sunken submarine. It made the quiet and unassuming Momsen a national hero. It showed the mettle of U.S. Navy divers and U.S. Navy submariners. In fact, every single crewman who survived this sinking continued to volunteer and serve on submarines. Not one of them quit or chose assignments on surface ships or ashore. As for Lieutenant Oliver Naquin, though he was praised for his cool action and effective leadership, he never served in submarines again and was never given another sea command. He was on the battleship USS California when Pearl Harbor was attacked. He also served as a chief navigator on the heavy cruiser USS New Orleans in the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. He reached the rank of Rear Admiral and he died in 1989 and rests with the best at Arlington. As for the Squalus, she was successfully raised after months of work and hundreds of dives. She was refurbished and recommissioned as the USS Sailfish and went on to conduct 12 war patrols, sinking numerous Japanese ships, including an escort carrier and a Japanese submarine, earning a Presidential Unit Citation. She was decommissioned in 1945 after the war. Her conning tower is at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard as a memorial. Electrician's Mate Third Class Lloyd Mannis, who closed the control room hatch, made it to chief, but was killed in action on 8 November 1944 when his sub, the USS Growler, was lost with all hands in the South China Sea. Chief Gaynor, who shut off the short-circuiting batteries of the sinking Squalus, survived World War II. He passed away on 8 July 1989 and is buried in a veterans cemetery in San Diego, California. Martin Sabitsky, the diver who connected the downhaul line to the forward escape hatch, received the Navy Cross for his epic dive. He was later commissioned an officer and in October of 1941, as a lieutenant junior grade, took command of the newly recommissioned minesweeper USS Red Wing. The Red Wing hit a mine off Tunisia, and though it lost some crewmen, Sabitsky survived, and in 1943 he commanded the salvage vessel USS Swivel. He retired as a full captain and passed away on 22 July 1988. Navy divers Chief Batters, Chief McDonald, and First Class Petty Officer Michalowski all received the Medal of Honor. As for Momsen, he too was at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked. In fact, when the destroyer Ward reported a submarine contact in the hour before the attack, Momsen sent another destroyer out to assist, bypassing his chain of command. He did this because, though submarine sightings were common, for the first time a destroyer had reported hit on a submarine with their main gun. Momsen's career had many more high points as he continued to battle and overcome the bureaucracy, and he served as commander, Submarine Squadron 4, and commanded the battleship USS South Dakota in 1944 and 45. He retired as a 3-star admiral. He died on May 25, 1967, at the age of 70, and he also rests with the best at Arlington.